Properties of operations. In this lesson, we discuss properties of operations. Now, notice that the operations we are going to be dealing with are these operations of additions, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So these are the four operations that we have basically in mathematics. And in this video, we discuss the properties. That is, how do we use these operations, especially when we are dealing with complex cases. And then we will break these properties of operations into the distributive property, that is like spreading it out, the commutative property, and then the associative property. So these are like the three major properties of operations. All these three properties, the distributive property, the commutative property, and the associative property, they will all make sense as we will begin to discuss them. And as I indicated earlier, when we talk of the operators or the signs of operation, we refer to addition represented by plus, minus for subtraction, multiplication by times, and division represented this way. So let's begin to break it down. The first operation or the first property we want to look at is the property which is known as the distributive property. What does it mean, distributive property? Now notice that to distribute in mathematics means to spread out. If we want to spread out something, we can use the term distribute. So then how is this related to mathematics? Well, when you look at this, to distribute, think of a number like this one here. Suppose that we have been given this expression here, which is what? 4. Okay. Well, let me first select that we are going to use. All right, so there we go. Suppose that we are dealing with 4 times what? Times 8 plus 3. If we are required to find this value, then we have a number of options. We could then say, well, this can be written as 4 times what? 4 times. Then what is inside the bracket? We can go ahead to add it. Okay. Now when we add what is inside the bracket, we get 11. And then this can still be simplified into what? Into 44. Well, that's a good one. But now here is the question. What if 3 was represented by some other letter? Okay. What if, and this is what I'm talking about. What if instead of having 4 times x, 8 plus x, rather 8 plus 3, we had 8 plus x. How would we handle this? Not only that, if 8 is also represented by some other letter, well, there is no way we can add x to 8 and get a single value right away from this expression. So how do we handle this type? The approach we use to simplify this type of expression is then guided by this property of operation known as the distributive property. What that then means is we can distribute 4 onto 8 and also onto the next term, which initially has been 3. Okay, so just to stick to this one a little bit, we will be having, that is 4 times inside the bracket we have 8 plus 3. Then now to distribute, that then means what is outside the bracket is distributed on all the quantities inside the bracket. The quantities inside the bracket this time is 8 and 3. Well, since the sign between them is multiplication right from out here, we can then write 4 distributed onto what? 8. Now notice that before we distribute 4 onto 3, there is a plus sign here. So we say 4 now distributed onto what? Onto 3. Then that way we can go ahead to simplify it, because then we know that 4 times 8 is 32, and also 4 times 3 is 12. Adding these two would give us a value of 44. Well, even if this method is a lot long, but it gives us a general approach which works for all type of expressions, especially when we are required to distribute a quantity which is outside the bracket to the terms inside the bracket. This is the method we use. So the distribution then means that the quantity outside the bracket is distributed on all the terms inside the bracket before everything can be simplified. Well, this is what we had. Now using an arrow, we could have this. So you see, this 4 then have got to be distributed onto 8 and onto 3. Now notice that we could have used a different sign of what? A different sign of operation. This time we have used a plus. Well, let me just put something quickly out here. So we are talking about distributive property. Okay, distributed of what? Of operators. So now we are using plus in this case, and when we use plus, that is what we get. Well, if we then don't have a specific value for the second term, then that means we have to look for a way of simplifying that. Well, in the case, we have used the method of distribution. Now, the next thing I would like us to look at is, what if this quantity 4, well, let's have this. What if instead of having a plus, we had a minus? How would we have done it? Well, we could have still done it the same way. Well, for 8 and 3, we can simplify that. And when we simplify that, we will be having what? We'll be having a 4 times, okay? A 4 times. Now, these quantities inside the bracket can be simplified because we know that 8 minus 3 is 5. And so we can have that. This then simplifies into 20. The problem now is, if we don't know one of the quantities inside the bracket. If we don't know the quantities inside the bracket, then we have to do what? We just have to distribute and leave everything. But if we do know, then it's a lot easier to deal with it. How about simplifying this using the approach of distribution? Will it give us 20? Well, let's check. So now for this case, we have 4, and this 4 is going to be distributed onto 8 and then later onto 3. That means we have to multiply 4 by what? By 8. And then, wait a minute, before we distribute 4 onto 3, remember there is a minus sign here, so we have it there. Now, when we have this minus sign right away there, the next thing we want to look at is going to be distributing A4 onto 3. That would give us A4 times what? Times A3. This way, we can extend our calculation. And from it, we get 32 for what? For 4 times 8 minus 12 for what? For 4 times 3. And this then simplifies into a 20. Well, that is what we got here. And it's also what we are getting this side. So the question now is, where else do we apply this distributive method, which make things a lot long? Well, we will be looking at a few activities really soon, and you will see that this method would not work. It will only be the distributive method or the distributive property of operations. Then let's go ahead and have what? An activity. I'm going to call it activity 1. So in activity 1, right here, we are supposed to do what? Well, okay. So in activity 1, we are supposed to distribute here, use distributive property to simplify each expression. Easy to medium problems. So there we go. Let's see how we get started. Now, the first thing here is activity 1, part 1. What are we supposed to do there? Well, we have been given a 7. Then 7 is outside of 1 minus 8n. See that? So how do we then simplify this using the distributive method? Now notice that in this case, what we are going to do is distribute 7 onto 1 and later 7 onto 8. Okay, when we distribute 7 onto 1, what we get is going to be a 7 what times a 1. Now remember, before we distribute a 7 onto 8, there is a minus sign. And so when we go ahead to distribute 7 onto 8, we will be having a 7 and what? An 8n. Then a 7 times a 1 gives a 7 minus a 7 times 8. Well, what's that? Let's use our calculator right away. 7 times 8 is 56. So we write here, this is 56. Remember, there is n there. We don't want to leave that n. It was already there, so we just keep having it. So this is how we distribute this expression. 7 times, inside the bracket is n, rather 1 minus 8n. Now, the next thing we want to look at is the second what? The second question, which is, well, negative 8, and inside the bracket we have what? We have a b plus a 3. So there we go, a b plus a 3. The question is, how do we handle this? Well, we have to distribute 8 onto this and then 8 onto that. Then, well, we have negative 8 that we have to multiply with what? We have to multiply. Now, notice that we have only one b, which we can write it like that. Yes, because there is only one b. We can write it as a b or a 1b. Let's write it as a 1b. Then, now notice that this negative 8 is also to be distributed onto what? onto 3. But there is a plus sign already there. Now, this gets a little bit interesting, but let's first write it. This time I'm going to use a bracket for -8. Then this -8 must be distributed onto what? Must be distributed onto 3. Now, why did we use a bracket for this? Well, we used a bracket because there is a conflict of sign here. Here we have a plus and here we have a minus. If we don't use a bracket, the conflict of sign is going to be very difficult for us to resolve. But if we do use a bracket, it's going to be easy for us to see that this minus sign will soon multiply this plus sign, and consequently, we will get the right quantity. So what are we then going to have? Well, notice that when we multiply a -8 by a 1, any quantity times 1, remains that quantity. It's like having something in its unit once or for the first time. And so it will stay the way it is, okay? Like when you buy a pair of shoes, if you buy one pair, it remains a single pair, okay? Even if there are 2 shoes, but it is a single pair. So that means if we multiply -8 or -8 by 1, we get -8. -8 of B. Okay, because we multiplied this -8 by 1 and we got -8. This B, we are keeping it, we are holding on to it because it was there right from the start. Okay, now the next thing we want to deal with is, what do we get when we multiply this by that? It's important that we multiply this quantity by that, that is plus times minus. Now notice that plus times minus gives a minus. And so when we now distribute 8 onto 3, that is multiplying 8 by 3, what we get is a 24. And this leads us to the solution of question 2. We can then extend our investigation onto question 3. What are we supposed to do to question 3? Well, we have been given what? A -6, okay? And this quantity is supposed to be distributed over 9 minus 9v. How do we do that? Well, then move on to distribute. Now, notice that if we have a minus sign outside, it's very important that we always use brackets. Even if we are distributing this on the first number, it's very necessary. The practice of using a bracket will make it easy for you, to process all the information without conflicting on the signs. And so when we multiply or when we distribute 6 onto 9, well, this will be a -6. That is, we can have it now inside the bracket as a negative what? A -6 by itself. This time it's distributed on what? On 9. Then there is a minus sign here. We now have to distribute -6 onto what? Onto -9, rather onto this 9 here. So this -6 will then have to be distributed. That is, we have to multiply that with a 9. Remember that this minus sign is what we have placed out here. So we are now dealing with what? We are dealing with 9v. Okay. From this stage, we can extend our discussion. Now notice that a minus times 9, the minus stays or the negative stays. Now, when we multiply 6 by 9, well, let's check. When we multiply 6 by 9, what we get is a 54. So then we have a 54. This 54 will later be followed by this. Now remember that when we multiply a negative quantity times another negative quantity, we get a positive quantity. And this positive quantity is going to come from a product of what? It's going to come from a product of 6 and 9, which we have already seen that would give us what? 54. And so for this reason, we will still have 54. What? With V attached. This V here. Now this is how we would handle this question, which is question 3. The next task is question 4. And what is it? Well, question 4 is having a minus, and this minus is the only thing outside the bracket. Inside the bracket, we do have a 3x, which is what? A minus. The question then is, how do we manipulate this? Now, notice that this minus out here, we can replace it with a minus 1 because there is only one minus you can see out there. So what I'm trying to say here is that this quantity can later be written with a 1 in front here. That way, it makes things a lot easier, because then we see that we have to distribute -1 or a -1 onto a 3 and then later onto a 9. So how do we do that? Well, we begin the distribution. Our first bracket stands for -1. Okay. Right away. Notice that this one is supposed to be distributed onto 3x. And now we have a minus sign here, which we put right away. After putting the minus sign, we then want to distribute -1 or -1. Okay. We want to distribute this -1 onto what? Onto 9. This minus, we have already written it here. So let's distribute that onto what? Onto 9. What is going to be our next step? Well, we then distribute this onto that. Now notice that -1 times 3 is -3. Then now the next thing is to attach x to it, because it was already there, even here and even in the original question. Then now notice that when we multiply a negative times a negative, we get a positive. Then we now want to distribute a 1 onto a 9. We are now done with this sign. So 1 times 9 is 9. And this becomes the solution. Now, the next thing we want to look at is question 5. Now, question 5 in activity 1 is given as -9. Okay. This -9 is supposed to be used to multiply the quantity what? The quantity n plus 6. Yes, -9 is supposed to be used to multiply the quantity n plus 6. Do we go ahead to simplify that? Well, now notice that in this case, this -9 outside the bracket is supposed to be distributed onto this. Now, maybe before we distribute, Let's first rewrite this question. I would like to write this one here as, okay. Now I would like to call this n, 1n, because there is only one value of n there that you can see for yourself. Okay, so when we do that, we then move on to the step of distribution. What are we going to distribute? Well, we are going to distribute -9 to what? 1n. Okay, so then that gives us 1n. Now notice that we also have to distribute -9 onto 6, but there is a plus here, so we have plus. Then now the next quantity is what? -9. Now this -9 is supposed to be distributed to 6 also. Now when we do that, what we get is going to be, well, -9 times 1 remains -9. Any quantity times 1 remain the way it is. And so -1 times 9 remains -9, not -1. We have 1 times -9 giving -9. Then now we would like to add this onto -9 times 6. So what do we get for that? Well, when we multiply -9 times 6, what we get is a 54. And so we write it here. But this time, the sign between will be minus. Why is that so? Because when you multiply a positive number by a negative number, the result will be a negative number. And so this will give us 54. Now notice that we did not write n here, so we need to put it. Yes. It's possible that sometimes because you are doing one calculation and you're focusing on something, you miss a point on one side. So as soon as you discover that something is missing, a letter is missing, a number is missing, you fix it immediately. Now, the next thing we want to look at is activity 1 part 6. Now, activity 1 part 6 has been given as 10 times the quantity inside the bracket is what? Is a plus 2. Yes, that is what we have. The question now is, how do we handle that? Well, the process is similar. Since the number is negative, we create a bracket so that we can distribute it nicely. Maybe before we start that, notice that the number inside here is 1, 1a. So I would like us to write that value of a with 1 as a coefficient, so that we then have these quantities times what? Times 1a. Now this way we can move on to do the distribution. So the distribution in this case will be the -10 must be distributed onto 1, and the -10 must also later be distributed onto a 2. And so when we distribute -10 onto 1a, well, that's what we will have. Now notice that there is a plus here. Well, this -10 should be inside the bracket. Right away. So now we have this one here, which is a plus. Now this -10 again must be distributed inside onto what? Onto a 2. Having -10 being distributed onto a 2. That it's now simplification. When we multiply -10 by 1, it stays as -10. As I indicated earlier on, a negative quantity or a positive quantity once will stay the way it is. That is, times 1 stays the way it is. So we will be having -10. But notice that there is a which is attached right there. So we also include it. And then now we want to add this. Now notice that even if there is sign of addition here, with this minus sign, when you multiply these two, what you get is a minus in total. And so we are minusing 20. And that becomes the solution. The 20 comes when we multiply this 10 times 2. Now the next thing we want to look at is question 7. Well, question 7 is a little bit expanded. Let's see how to write it. So question 7, we do have the quantity what? The quantity 5k minus what? Minus 10. Now this is being multiplied with what? Is being multiplied with -9. Okay, let's use this sign here. Times -9. We could have used a dot. It's also fine. Now notice that to simplify this, we have to distribute. Now whether the quantity outside the bracket is on the left-hand side or right-hand side, the simplification remains the same. The expansion remains the same. So now that then means this -9 must be distributed onto 5 here and also onto 10. And so what do we get? Well, we will be having -9 distributed onto what? Distributed onto 5k. And later, okay, that is minus. This -9 must also be distributed onto what? Onto -10. That is -9 must also be distributed. Must also be distributed onto this 10 here. Notice that the negative here is already in this position, and so we are remaining only with a 10. And so we do what? We distribute it out right away. The next step then is to expand the quantities. And so what do we get with that? Well, when we multiply a 9 and a 5, we get a 45. But remember, there is a negative sign or a minus sign. So this will be minus 45 of k. Now notice that when we multiply a minus and a minus, we get a plus. So then that means after the first term, we will be having a plus 9 times 10, which is what? 90. Yes, that is how we would simplify the question. Now the next thing we want to look at is activity 1 part 8. How do we simplify that? Well, we have a -4 times what? -4 times, we have inside the bracket is 4 plus 3. How do we simplify that? Well, same process. We want to take this -4 and distribute it onto this +4 and also onto this 3. And so we will be having -4, this time distributed onto what? Onto a 4. Notice that this plus sign here is this one here, which is copied. And now we have to take -4, okay? We having what? A negative 4, that is minus 4, distributed onto 3, that is distributed onto 3. But remember, P is attached right away. So this way then, we can move on to the next step. Now notice that F4 times F4 is 16. Since this is positive and this is negative, the product of the two will be negative. So we will be having what? Minus 16. Then we also have a 4 and a 3. But notice that this is minus and here it's plus. A minus times a plus gives a minus. So we'll be having there minus what? Minus 12p. And this forms the solution of question 1, that is activity 1, question 8. We can then move on and check activity 2. Well, activity 2 is saying use distributive property and combining like terms to simplify these quantities. Okay, so this time the discussion is expanding. Now we are no longer only looking at expansion or simply distribution. We are also looking at simplifying the additional components that we are going to find inside the what? The expression. That then means where there is need, you add. Where there is need, you subtract. So this is going to be what? Activity 2. So let's have activity 2 right away. So here we go. Activity 2 continues with numbering of 9 to 10, then to 11, and also to 12. So where do we start from? Well, let's start from 9. Now notice that from 9, we have given negative 6 of what? Negative 6 times the quantities inside the bracket. They are x plus what? Minus negative by the minus 2. So how do we then distribute this? Well, someone would think that this negative 2 should be distributed onto 2 and onto x. Then the next question would be, what do we then do with this negative 6? Now, notice that negative 6 is having a sign of multiplication between itself and x plus 2. Yes. But now, this minus 2 is having a sign of minus between itself and the x plus 2. Now, notice that for a quantity to be considered multiplication, to be able to be distributed, that quantity must be having a sign of multiplication, or at least it must be having the property of multiplication in it. It must be attached in such a way that it is multiplying the other quantities, not that it is being added to, not that it is being subtracted from. It must be a multiplication for distributions to work. So what we are trying to say here is that we are going to have this negative 6 being distributed onto what? Well, this negative 6 will then be distributed onto x. So we are going to be negative 6 distributed onto x. Or we can call it 1x. Then later, we will have negative 6 distributed onto 2. That is negative 6. Negative 6 is being distributed onto what? Onto a 2. That is times 2. Then now this way, we can later copy the 2 which is remaining. Here, we can expand our discussion. Now notice that negative 6 times 1 is negative 6. And so we put negative 6. But there is x which is attached. And so we also write it there. The next thing we are looking at is what happens when we multiply a plus and a minus. Well, we get a minus for that. Then now when we multiply a 6 times a 2, we get a 12. And from it, we should later take away 2. So then this way, we can simplify our expression. And we get what? Well, we get 6x, which is the first term right here. Then now these 2 can be simplified into what? Into negative 14. Well, how do we reach negative 14? Well, we first reach negative 12. If we are using a number line, we first reach negative 12. Then again, we move 2 steps in the negative direction. That should give us a value of negative 14. Well, how about question 10? Activity 2, question 10. What are we supposed to do with question 10? Well, question 10 we have for n minus, okay, minus what? 7 minus 6n. So inside the bracket we have 7 minus 6n. Yes. So how do we then simplify this? Well, there is no way we can put this 4 in front here so that it multiplies this. It will not be right. And now what is going to be right is we instead have this 4, instead have this. We would rather have a 1 outside the bracket right there. Okay, so that it is easy to see that we are distributing negative 1 onto a 7 and negative 1 onto a 6n. Now that way we can get somewhere. And what is that? It's going to be 4n, which is the first term. Then we have minus. This one is to be distributed onto 7. So we have then 1 times what? And now the next thing we want to do is to expand and get this 1 to be distributed onto 6. So we put here this minus. After that, the next thing we want to look at is this 1 and the what? And the 6. So notice that this 1 is negative. So I'm going to put it inside the bracket. 1. Now after putting it inside the bracket, we then have to multiply this with a 6. And so we distribute it then onto what? 6. This one can then later be simplified. But notice that the 6 is having n attached to it. And now because of that, we also have to include the n in our calculation. And so here we have 4n. We still keep it with us. This is what? 4n. Then now we have this 1 and 7, but there is a minus before. So we put the minus. Then 1 times 7 is 7. Then the next thing is now what? Negative times negative, which is a plus. 1 times 6 is what? 6. But remember, there is n attached. So at this stage, the next thing we want to do, the thing we don't want to forget is to add these 2 now. collect them so that they stay together. They will become like terms. And so when we collect them, we'll be having 4n added to what? To 6 what? 6n. This will be taken 7. And so this will then give us a 10n, okay, minus a 7. That gives us the solution of this question. So yes, it is true that sometimes the concept of distribution gets to be extended into calculating some other things, like the way we are seeing. We will then move on to question 11. Now, question 11, which is under activity 2, is requiring us. Okay. Question 11 under activity 2 is requiring us to simplify -3 minus 7 times the whole of this. Okay, so let's first have it written down. Question 11, right here. Then now, which is missing here is what? Is the question itself, which is -3 minus 7, okay? That is -3 minus 7. And then we use that to multiply -3, okay, minus 6v. Yes, that is what we have inside the bracket. The question is, how do we then simplify that? Well, the number which is attached to the bracket is 7. 3 is out. And so we then have -3, then minus. So now we have to distribute 7 onto minus what? 3. And so when we distribute 7 onto -3, which we can easily put inside the bracket, we then have minus 3. And later we want to distribute -7 onto -6v. So that we then give -7, then -6v. Okay, that is -7, then -6v. So that is how we get the value. And now in the step, we want to see how to simplify. And so that will be -3, which is the first term, this one here. Then when we distribute this 7 on this, we get 21. But remember, there is a minus and a minus there. And so we'll be having plus 21, because any two negatives, when they are made to multiply themselves, we get a positive quantity. Then also we have a minus here and a minus there. So that will also be a plus. But this is going to be a 7 times a 6. And so what is the value of 7 times 6? Well, 7 times 6 will give us the value of 42. And so we can go ahead and put it here as what? As 42. 42 of what? Of v. Right away. So we then want to simplify before we conclude. So to simplify, when we add -3 to 21, what do we get? Well, we get 18. This time 18 is being added to 42v. And this is the solution. Now, the last question of activity 2 is question 12. And how do you handle question 12? Yes, we've been given 5. We are supposed to use to do what? To multiply. And what are we multiplying? Well, inside the bracket we have a minus 6. Then out outside the bracket we have plus 2a. So then how do we simplify this? Let's make it a little bit easier. We can then make this one be having 1a. So the way we have been doing it, this will give us -5. This time distributed onto what? Distributed onto 1a. That is like that. Then now we want to look at how to distribute a -5, that is minus -5 and the 6. So let's have that right away as a -5 and what? A 6. And a 6. So -5 this time is distributed onto a 6. Like that. Remember the minus before 6 is already right here. So onto this we are supposed to add 2a. Then how do we continue? Well, notice that a 5 times 1 is a 5, but it is a minus because of this one here. Then now when we multiply these two, we get a plus. That is when we multiply minus times minus, we get a plus. Now notice that 5 times 6 is a 30. Yes, for this. Then now we have what? A 2a. Yes, we can to simplify this into a 5 plus a 35 is a 30 is the same as 30 minus 5, which gives us positive 25. This time it's added to 2a. And please note that this becomes the solution for what? For activity 2, question 12. So at least up to this activity, we have been looking at how to distribute. Now in the next lesson, we will see how we can not only distribute, but distribute and also add one more property. And what is that property? Well, the property of commutation. That is the commutative property of operation. That is going to be our next discussion. For now, this discussion ends on activity 2, question 12.